Okay, well, our speaker today is Professor of History of Political Thought at Royal Holloway at the University of London. If I can trust his Wikipedia entry, if I can't, anyone can go and change it, including him, so I'm going to trust it. He's taught at universities in Germany and America. His interests lie in the history of radicalism and socialism in 19th century Britain, utopianism from 1700 to 2001. I don't know what's happened to the last 13 years. Social Darwinism and eugenics, and British intellectual history from 1750 to the present. He's written and edited numerous books on these subjects, including Thomas Paine, Robert Owen, John Stuart Mill, and H.G. Wells. And on the John Stuart Mill theme, you may well be familiar with the little very short introductions, the Oxford books, and our speaker today is writing one on John Stuart Mill. It's probably going to be a couple of years before that comes out. And I said to him, it seems strange that they haven't done that one already. But apparently it was an oversight. But anyway, that's coming out in the future. Given his credentials, I don't know why we haven't invited him before now, but I'm absolutely delighted that he's here today. Will you please give a very warm welcome to Greg Claeys.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. I think we should start today, given the horrifying events of the assassination of 8 journalists in Paris on Wednesday. Journalists who described themselves and were described by their colleagues as humanists, with a minute's silence in commemoration of the sacrifice which they very consciously made in the name of the cause which most of us adhere to today. So if we could just stop for 1 minute to consider the fate they have suffered for all of us. Thank you very much for observing this event in this way. I'd like to start with a very general discussion about what humanism is. I was asked to speak to a brief, clearly which addressed the issue of this year's coming elections. There are some narrower and some broader issues directly relating to May 2015, which of course we all would want to think about as voters. On the other hand, I think that we want to consider a broader range of questions which specifically arise as a result of our commitment to the set of beliefs that we call humanism. And of course, not everyone subscribes to the same set of beliefs, and heaven knows, so to speak. We want to be tolerant about the very large church that we belong to. I will remain with religious metaphors for any number of reasons. Secularism, humanism is a kind of faith of its own as well as a set of principles based upon rational and empirical suppositions. So let's start out just by reminding ourselves what our starting point was and how we got to where we are at the moment. The term humanism, as you're probably all aware, dates roughly from the Renaissance, recalls to mind the discovery or the rediscovery of classical philosophic principles, the Greeks and the Romans in particular, the growing realization that there was another view of the world outside of that of the Christian church. This begins in the 16th century. Throughout the 16th and 17th century, there is a growing sense amongst educated people of skepticism, of course, about the principal claims of Christianity. Up until about the middle end of the 18th century, depending on where you lived in Europe, it was more or less dangerous, of course, to assert such principles in public. But by the end of the 17th century, in particular as a result of biblical criticism, within educated circles it became possible to be more and more distanced from the Christian tradition. Outside, no, not until the French Revolution, but within educated circles it is possible, as historical scholarship began to excavate more deeply into the construction of the Bible, to make assertions about its historicity, about the fact that different books were composed at different times, that the story of Jesus, the Old and the New Testament, are not all of a piece, that in fact, as Thomas Paine expressed it, the whole was a sum of stories, poems, fairy tales, historical truth, and so on, all mixed up together. Throughout the 18th century, the project that's associated with what we call the Enlightenment began increasingly to see this enterprise of what we might today call the deconstruction of the Bible as linked to a broader approach known to us today as the scientific method, an approach which limits our view of the world to what we can empirically see and understand and verify others having seen and understood. You don't have to see everything to believe in its truth, clearly. But this does lead us to a viewpoint whereby we are skeptical about claims made about entities, beings, events, and so on. And of course, the principle of God first and foremost, which do not present obvious evidence to our senses. We're increasingly skeptical through this period of accounts given to us from the past, from stages of social, economic, political, psychological development, which are relatively much less sophisticated than our own, and we reach a position whereby we're unwilling to countenance as of a piece fairies, goblins, ghouls, demons, the devil, God, and so on. The same basic principle applies to all of the non-rational or irrational world. The 18th century, of course, the greatest figure in this country to pronounce in this way is David Hume, the great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher. The French Revolution represents a major watershed for humanists. Clearly, there is an attempt here also to put in the place of Christianity a kind of secular religion, not a very successful attempt. Many of them haven't been, sadly. But this is the point at which what was previously only discussed amongst educated people breaks out into the open. And now, for the first time, perhaps dangerously, it becomes possible amongst the mass of the people of the countries of Europe, at least, to talk about the first principles of religion and indeed to express skepticism about them. Since that period, of course, the theory known as secularization assures us, religious belief in most countries has been gradually falling off. We know that this is the case in Britain. Church attendance falls off through the 19th, into the 20th century, into the 21st century. polls taken in most European countries, certainly in Britain, indicate a declining belief in the existence of God at the same time. Is there any moral outcome which is explicitly negative as a result of this decline in the belief of God? No, there isn't. There are more reported crimes of certain kinds, but there is no evidence whatsoever that there is statistically any kind of correlation between the decline in religious belief and criminality, immorality, whatever else you want to associate with it. So, through the 19th century, this skepticism becomes more and more pronounced. We think of Thomas Paine, we think of Robert Owen, we think of John Stuart Mill, whom you've already heard of. As we reach the 20th century, writers like Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, a whole host of others, prominently begin to take the side of what we today refer to as humanism. Now, the humanist viewpoint, I don't want to speak, of course, on behalf of everyone, because I've already said we disagree about all manner of things. Some of us are agnostics, some of us are atheists. It's not impossible at all to believe in a God or gods of many kinds, and to be a humanist either. What humanism means, first and foremost, however, is that we do share some commitment to trying to regulate affairs in human society, in this world, in our own lives, in a better manner than we think they've been managed in the past. That is to say, we are progressive, we are improvers, we are critical, we are skeptical about many other things besides religion. We have an agenda of sorts, and we don't define that agenda the same way. We don't even define the first principles which underpin that agenda in the same way. My own approach here, and I stress this is fairly personal, although it's shared by many others in the humanist movement, is through one or another variations on utilitarianism, the idea that the basic point of society is to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number, that whatever happens after we die, we don't have any knowledge of this. One religion's claim about its God or gods is to us as equally invalid as the claims of another religion, because at the end of the day, there isn't any proof for anybody's assertions. And if any of them are right, it means all the rest are wrong. So we simply remain in the secular domain. Our concern is with human behavior and human affairs in this life. But of course, beyond this, we also offer the principle that by and large, despite the fact that it can be said that religion has certain beneficial consequences to certain people, by and large, historically, the record is more negative than positive. And that is why, by and large, we tend to oppose religion in principle. Now, I'll come back to the events of this week as to what this implies for the present and what it implies vis-a-vis particular religions. It doesn't mean an out-and-out brawl every time you come across anybody who isn't a humanist, or we'd all end up in A&E, and we know what to expect there, a very long way, if nothing else. What it does clearly mean is an element of confrontation. It does, for us, mean that reasonable debate, not clearly violence, that is not our way, but reasonable debate with people who hold beliefs which are profoundly, markedly different from ours, and people who hold such beliefs with a degree of emotional intensity which, it has to be said, is by and large lacking on our side. Most humanists, unlike our 8 journalist colleagues in Paris, don't, thankfully, have to die for their beliefs, not at least in this country, but in many other countries, of course. The prospect of offering in public what we term humanist beliefs is to invite persecution, imprisonment, torture, death. So we count it, of course, as amongst our blessings that in this environment we can speak freely. And it is, of course, that cause for which our 8 colleagues died, and it is for that cause which we have to continue to fight, and fight indeed with renewed vigor. Only that freedom of speech protects all of us in this room. It's not an impossible scenario that the day may come when we're not permitted to have a talk like this one this afternoon. We need to consider just how valuable it is that we can assemble in this way. What that means at the same time is that these confrontations have to be genteel, polite, and civilized. Not that we avoid such confrontations as such, but I'll return to that question in a moment. Having said that, I link myself loosely to utilitarianism broadly as the foundation for a humanist outlook. This is a secular ideal, I think, by and large, more than anyone else, but it is John Stuart Mill who offers us the best single description in his famous work on liberty, published in 1859, of how we should relate to the behavior of others in society. And Mill there, this is not a university lecture, but just to remind all of you, Mill there offers us what he calls a very simple principle, the harm principle, that we should not interfere with the behavior of others when they are not harming us. The intention behind this, although harm is notoriously difficult to define in many circumstances beyond obvious physical violence, intention behind this is simply to prevent people from exercising prejudices, for Mill based principally on religion, and interfering in the behavior of others by prohibiting them from shopping on a Sunday or eating certain foods or engaging in certain activities in the bedroom and so on. Mill wanted to cut through all of these inherited historical prejudices and to establish one simple principle which we could use in our dealings with others. If someone is not harming me by and large, although there are certain caveats here, I don't and we don't socially or politically have a right to interfere with their behavior. Now this means that the domain of belief must be absolutely free. And indeed, the position that Mill takes in on liberty is much more, one might say, libertarian than the position which most governments today promote. We have, of course, legislation about, I'll come back to this later as well, hate speech, and so on. We have hedged in freedom of speech in all manner of ways, particularly in the last 20 years, in an effort to avoid the kind of affront and offense, which I'll come back to again in a moment, which has proven so disturbingly turbulent, both this week, but also, of course, on a variety of previous occasions. So it's my belief that if we take these principles to their logical conclusion, we have what you would expect a humanist to have, an essentially humane outlook upon both the members of our own society and the members of other societies. This means that if we ask certain basic broad questions, like, is it possible to be a national chauvinist and a humanist? The answer has to be no. Humanism is about the whole human species. Half the argument, after all, against other forms of belief systems that are essentially religious is that they divide humanity. They code people according to the group to which they belong, and they code our group as good and the other group as bad. And it doesn't matter where you are or country you're brought up in, at what time, what age, this general rule applies. We're the good guys, the other guys are bad. This in and of itself is, to a humanist, offensive, very clearly. There's no sense in it. I often recall when my children would sit in the back of the car heading off for the annual summer holiday when they were small. My two twin sons would start usually an argument within about 100 yards of leaving home. And the argument would run the following way. One would say to the other, if we were home now, it would be my turn to watch television. And the other would say, no, it would be my turn, and then they would start fighting about it. This to me epitomizes exactly what much religious controversy has been throughout the ages. We look for reasons to differentiate between ourselves. There are various psychological reasons for this, which would be interesting to explore if we had the time. We like to differentiate because this in some way empowers us. We want to be in the group which is successful, which has wealth, which has territory, which has power, which has the women or the herds or whatever it is that we value. And we don't want others to have these things, and therefore we code them with some label, but of course can be race, ethnicity, nationality, all sorts of other things. Religion is one amongst the most powerful of these, because of course, not only is it one of the strongest forms of identity, even stronger than football, even stronger than nationalism, but as a form of identity, it purports to offer answers to questions which even football and politics cannot. The eternal questions, where we came from, who caused all this, where we go to, and what happens in the afterlife. No other form of belief system can offer the range of answers that religion does, and that's why it is our principal antagonist and our greatest enemy. So that, I think, gives a sense of at least where I'm coming from in terms of what humanism is about. The central point to be made about the application of the principle of harm to everyday life is that it doesn't produce automatically a political agenda. There is no humanist solution to the budget deficit. There's no humanist solution to the euro crisis. There's no humanist solution to the immigration question. All of these questions need to be discussed, and heavens knows they're all extremely pertinent to the debate coming up over the next 4.5 months or so. But there's no particular humanist outlook on these issues, although one can argue that there is a greater or lesser human good in a variety of different responses. But there is no automatic agenda. What we do, however, recognize is that the establishment of the operation of the harm principle, that is to say that in every action we engage in, we should not harm others, does run up against existing practices often based upon religious belief, in which harm is an obvious result of the religious practice/belief. Now, one of the examples I'll come back to later is female genital mutilation, FGM. This has been in the press quite a lot recently, although it wasn't much discussed before 3 or 4 years ago. It's now, however, widely understood, not of course intentionally to be a form of harm, although some argue that it is that, in clitorectomy in particular, in removing part of the female genitalia. It is an attempt to deny women sexual pleasure, and therefore an act of barbarism and cruelty as such. But others describe it, I've had some interesting discussions with my own students in this regard, as simply a cultural practice, which relativistically we ought to tolerate because historically it has been a practice enjoined by and taken up by very large numbers of people, hundreds of millions. Well, this is the point at which we confront a practice which, for us, clearly evidences harm, harm of the most extreme kind. I mean, thousands of women die and many hundreds of thousands more are seriously mutilated as a result of this operation, even when it's successful. So there is a point where the general idea of tolerance based on the harm principle translates into the intolerance of activities which we ourselves deride or declaim against as not merely offensive, but physically harmful. And that is the front line of our confrontation with those who hold beliefs contrary to our own. So I now want to turn to more pressing immediate issues and move away from the general idea of what I think humanism is about. There are 8 issues that I've identified there are many more that we could talk about, but that broadly cover, I think, the ground that we would want to consider as voting humanists to be issues that we would want before the public, to the degree that we're willing to raise our heads above the parapet, and on the desks of politicians asking for our vote. Most of the existing political parties, it has to be said, are not very keen on most aspects of the humanist agenda, but certain points, even by the present government, the issue of FGM is one of them, have been taken up and are important to both us and to them. But on other issues, there's a very great distance between what I think most of us subscribe to as a worldview and the worldview being promoted by the mainstream political parties. So, the first and most obvious debate is the freedom to criticize religion. The right to offend. Well, before Charlie Hebdo, we had Theo van Gogh, we had the Danish cartoons, we had the Fatwa and Sami Rushdie, all of course emanating from the same source, namely the offense perceived by Muslims, who are the single most important group we need obviously to discuss in this regard, relating to either descriptions of or caricatures of or portrayals of their notional prophet, Muhammad, and or other types of description of their religion which they have found offensive. Now we recognize here, as I said a moment ago, a much more intimate, powerful sense of identity related to religion in this case than is the case by and large today with Christianity. If we were to go back 300 years, however, we would see that the pattern of behavior is approximately the same. To affront a Christian in the mid-17th century from what we would today call a secularist or a humanist viewpoint, or a heretical viewpoint, or a viewpoint alien to any other aspect of Christianity, would have been to have invited exactly the same response that the more extremist Muslims exhibit today in our portrayal, satirically, in caricature of aspects of their religion. So this is not a feature which is unique to Islam. It's not a feature which is unique to this particular group amongst, it's by no means, of course, majority. It's a very small minority of Muslims, as we know, but there is a larger hinterland of people who feel very deeply offended, not specifically necessarily at these expressions of what they regard as contempt for their religion, but rather for what they, in some respects, quite rightly regard as a crusading attitude of Western, in particular European and countries and the United States, towards not merely Islam, but the whole of the nations, from Africa through the Middle East in particular, in which Islam is a dominant religion. So this is not a matter of philosophic principle, it's not a matter of religious belief. This is a matter of oil, it's a matter of war, it's a matter of territory. A great deal, as we know, of the reaction which is expressed symbolically in religious terms is actually about the Iraq wars, it's about the alliance of the United States with Saudi Arabia. That's what bin Laden told us after 9/11. After all, the occupation of Saudi Arabia by American troops was one of the issues that he pointed to as causing 9/11. So one ought to avoid perhaps regarding the contemporary confrontation as emanating simply from philosophic and religious disagreement. It is much more than that. Nonetheless, having said that, do we have a right to offend others? And if we have such a right, in what circumstances should we or can we, or is it prudent to exercise such a right? Very easy to answer the first question. The answer is, of course, yes. For the obvious reason that if I was to say something which was to offend only one person in this room, and that one person said, sorry, I'm offended, and I had to stop as a result, and there will always be one person, there always is in a group of this size, then I wouldn't actually be able to say anything meaningful at all. And all conversation would come to an end. Well, the whole point about freedom of speech, freedom of discussion, freedom of the press, is that this not only is the only way of preserving a democratic society, it's also the only way of moving a society progressively onwards in such a way that we actually can improve it. And at the moment, there are very few signs that we are improving it very well. So freedom to offend, yes, very clearly. Through caricature, yes, very clearly. We have to recognize that the sensibilities of Muslims in this case are greater than ours are vis-a-vis if we happen to be practicing Christianity. We have learned over, and we've learned the hard way, of course, the way everything else was learned practically, over the last 200 or 300 years, that it's only through criticism that we can move forward as a society. But we've also learned that it is possible to accept, with a grain of salt, satire, caricature. It is possible to accept people who insult the Bible, who deny the existence of God, without ourselves getting horrendously worked up about it. We live in a society in which it is possible, from the Christian viewpoint, to contemplate and to tolerate that kind of satire, if for no other reason than we recognize that, of course, it is precisely that toleration which gives every group, and because practicing Christians are in a minority too, it gives every group the right, as a minority, to practice vis-a-vis the views and ideas of the majority. This toleration then is essential for all of us, not merely for Muslims. So, from the word go, we then have to recognize that if we are going to offend people, so be it. Now, having said that, you all probably know the famous description of the person who shouts fire in the crowded theater. You don't want to go up to the local mosque and say, well, this is what I think of your religion because look what has just happened in Paris. First of all, people who go to the local mosque are not responsible for it. The vast majority of Muslims have condemned this action justifiably as barbaric. Secondly, of course, where is that getting you? If the point is rational debate, if the point is scrutiny of people's beliefs, if the point is, and this is something sadly that Islam has not taken on board by and large, the gradual historical deconstruction of the way in which the religion itself evolved by looking at the text and by seeing how they were assembled, such that we reach the approximate viewpoint that a lot of this is simply put together by priests who have an interest in having a certain agenda, a narrative, a story sold to the public, if for no other reason than that's how priests make their living, after all. Well, we have to acknowledge that Islam has not moved even in this sense as far forwards, not as our Enlightenment, but even the Reformation of the 16th century. All of that has to happen. Every religion needs to have a historical sense of its own origins because that's the only way in which you can sort out the fact from the fancy. Nonetheless, the confrontation which will result from offending will continue. What we've seen this week is barbaric, it's tragic, it's shocking in the extreme. We can expect more of the same, I think, to come in the future. It should not deter us, however, from ensuring that in the context of rational debate, it doesn't have to be amicable because it's possible for sharp criticisms to emerge in such a context as well. But in rational debate, we can engage with anyone in a free society. That's the very foundation of the system that we embrace as humanists. We all recognize, secondarily, that one of the engagements we will need to have in this regard is the religious pretext that is given by, in this case, the killers of the 8 journalists for their actions. Now, this is not merely a defense of the honor of their prophet, which is one of the explanations that's been given us. It's also the fact that they claim that martyrdom follows the acts that they have committed. Now, we think that this is very unlikely to be the case. It's a nice belief. We all know that the bride that Christians get is called heaven. Once upon a time, that's why the Reformation took place. Amongst other things, you could just bribe the church and buy your way in. But that was, of course, from the 21st century. This seems very implausible, doesn't it? And it seems equally implausible that killing other people because of your religious beliefs is going to guarantee you a place in heaven. Much less with the dancing girls and all the rest. We have every right to challenge the ludicrousness of these beliefs. But there are other peaks, let's not forget this, with the belief that Christians have in heaven in general, and with a lot of other beliefs. I mean, hell is just pretty much the same thing. Each of these fictitious concepts has a history. We know that heaven doesn't appear out of nowhere, neither does hell, nor God, nor Satan, and so on. You can trace historically the evolution of all of the concepts, see how they were put, often by committees of bishops, into place to form the narrative and the story that's given to us today. If, as humanists, we are willing to challenge the Christian account of this, we cannot be, despite the greater risk, the less willing to challenge a Muslim version of the same set of what are for us fictions. So the first line of confrontation here has to be, in this sense, still theological. We not only, of course, challenge those who engage in violence on the basis of their religious beliefs, we challenge the nature of those beliefs themselves. The risks here are quite considerable, and again, this is why rational debate is absolutely essential. We don't stand up in front of the mosque, we don't even, by and large, stand up on a soapbox in whatever the local town square is here. But we do talk to each other. We talk all the time, we talk constantly, and we make a real effort to try to socialize with those of different belief systems, to attempt to persuade them of what we regard as the irrationality of their beliefs. The harm principle extends to a number of other issues that we will probably have to consider in the coming months or years. You're all aware, I'll just point to some of these rather than describe them in length, of the debate about the burqa in France. The Islamic veil is now prohibited in public in France. This wouldn't meet Mill's harm qualifications, I don't think. I think this is, by and large, this is a peculiar French approach, of course, in a secular republic state, but by and large not an approach that Mill would have warmed to. There is no particular harm in the symbolism posed by the burqa. What is clear, I think, and I take here a quote from The Guardian of the 8th of January, is that the proper response to the issues before us today is not a religious response. This is from an opinion piece by a man named Ed Hussein, who said of those who committed the murders the previous day, "They kill in the name of religion. We cannot respond by citing the virtues of Darwin, secularism, and materialism. The only language these radicals understand is that of religion. It is by mustering the best of religion that we can defeat the worst of it." Well, do we subscribe to this view? No. By and large, we don't. We do believe that there are virtues in even agnosticism, atheism, and so on. It's possible, we know, to lead a good, meaningful, humane life without recourse to any theological prop. As a final issue, of course, with respect to the question of the right to offend others, is the question which is legislatively the most difficult and the one which has been most before us in the last 7 or 8 years. The question of hate speech, and the question as to when offense is translated into or perceived as hate. Now, we have a very similar problem as we have with the definition of offense as such, namely that some adherents to some religions, and Muslims are first and foremost perhaps in this regard, but it's almost universally true, will regard something that offends them as hateful, and therefore will describe the language used and or acts used wielded against them as hateful. This is an extraordinarily difficult issue to legislate about. We are enjoined now legally not to promote the hatred of religions or races. It's a very difficult line for us to trespass because, for obvious reasons, as I've just stated, subjectively, much of what we promote can be understood as hateful to those who perceive themselves as the targets of it. I think the only initial response really to have to this line of attack against us is to be temperate, first of all, not to use language which is hateful. Why bring the name of the prophet into contention when what we want to discuss are broadly theological principles? However, if, for example, the production of caricatures, as was the case in Charlie Hebdo, is viewed as hateful by those who are offended by it, there is very little that we can do to avoid our expression of our sarcasm in such cases. The degree of contempt we feel for a particular religious viewpoint is allowed satirically in a country which possesses a free press. We could perhaps talk about this in discussion, but I think a great deal of this issue hinges on exactly how we promote the kind of agenda which concerns us. Let me move secondly to questions which are more immediate both to the British Humanist Association and to the current political agenda. The first relates to education. Well, we all know we have a major problem in this country. A third of our state-funded schools are so-called faith schools. In many areas, there are more or less overt attempts by churches to exert pressure upon parents to attend church in order to gain a place in school. It's quite clear if we look at the content of teaching in a whole range of schools that if creationism is not on the increase, evolutionism is challenged in any number of different areas. The line that the PhD has taken on this, and the line I think that most of us would subscribe to, is that the teaching of a single religion in any school is abhorrent. Now, to my mind, the idea of a faith school is abhorrent as well. I simply am an opponent as such, and in particular, I'm an opponent of state funding for schools of any so-called faith. I think if people want to send their kids to a Saturday school which accords with the beliefs of that particular family or grouping, that's fine. But what the general public is doing, deliberately creating divisiveness in the community and funding it from the public purse, this, I feel, goes very much against the grain of the kind of society which we ought to be creating. Should faith schools then exist at all? Well, as I just said, I don't think so. I am really quite strongly opposed in this regard. There are questions that we might entertain in this regard. But here, first and foremost, we've seen the tendency for divisiveness to grow out of the existing system. Now, we'll point out straight away, of course, that this is a cross-party issue. It was under Tony Blair, of course, that much of the current development of the faith school program and agenda began. This is not a Tory conspiracy. This is, in many respects, I think, an attempt by Christians or a post-Christian kind of society to try to come to terms with multiculturalism and to express a certain kind of toleration, while at the same time, quietly or not so quietly, promoting an overtly Christian agenda. An agenda supposedly in dialogue with the other major religions, but a Christian agenda as such. I don't frankly see the point of doing this in the public. And that brings me to the second major general issue before us politically. How does humanism address the question of religion in public life? Well, some of you will know a quote I will read out now from Nicky Morgan, the Secretary of State for Education, who told us not too long ago, "My mission in Parliament is to remember the Word of God and serve the Lord." Well, we have 26 bishops, of course, in the House of Lords and the House of Incorrigibles, which we have no end of trouble reforming, and they do represent, of course, the established Church of England. They don't any longer, I think it's pretty clear, represent the views of the majority of members of this country, but they're still there, and they're there symbolically of the lack of separation between church and state. Now, if there's any one issue perhaps that most humanists, but you'll no doubt disagree with me afterwards, can concede in this regard, it is that religion should not play this role in public life. The separation of church and state, which of course is unfortunately more a fiction in the United States than not, is nonetheless a constitutional assurance that one religion is not supposed to predominate over all the rest, and that one religious agenda is not supposed to dictate to all the rest. It doesn't work that way in the States, it wouldn't work that way here either. But at least we would have some kind of assurance that whatever people's private beliefs are, and we do want to insist that they have, and we have died for, and will continue to die for, their right to believe anything in private life they want to believe, and to practice the harm principle in view. Any practice in private life they want. That in public there is no place for the expression of such belief. There is certainly a place for the expression of moral principle. Those who accuse us of being immoral and say that all morality comes from religion, of course, are extraordinarily mistaken in this regard. But it is nonetheless the case, and we could perhaps ask a great deal more morality, certainly when it comes to having their hands in the till out of our politicians. It is certainly the case that such morality ought not to come with specifically religious message attached to it. This means that the promotion of a faith agenda by, for example, the former so-called Minister of Faith and Communities, Baroness Worsey, who has assailed the BHA on a number of occasions, has to be opposed by us as much as possible. Now, this is the first of a number of issues, perhaps, that we can put before MPs and prospective members of Parliament in the coming election. The House of Lords has been due for reform for over a century, certainly. It's been discussed actively in the last 20 years. Amongst the many possibilities that certainly we could all of us here agree on is that those 26 bishops ought to be out of any future second legislative chamber. We may want a chamber of experts, we may want a mixture of appointments and elections and expertise. No matter what the principle is, it's quite clear that no religious grouping ought to have a place in this body. Philosophers maybe. The exponents of a particular religious viewpoint, no, I don't think so. An additional part of the agenda for Parliament respects foreign policy. Now, there is such a thing, if there is no humanist politics, there is such a thing as a humanist foreign policy. The attack on gay rights, for example, in countries like Uganda, can be opposed in the international sphere, has been, and must consistently be so. I mentioned FGM earlier. Women's rights, of course, are still not recognized in a very large number of countries in the world. We haven't made all that much progress in our own, after all, but there are many countries in which women occupy a much more subservient position still, in which they are denied education, in which they are engineered into forced marriages, and so on. In all of these areas, we ought to be promoting broadly a more liberal agenda. Harm is also about relative equality. It's about promoting people's ability to lead a decent, civilized, rich, fulfilling life. And that can't be done when people are forced into grinding poverty, and it certainly can't be done where half the human species is forced constantly into subjection by the other half. The minority rights of religious groupings in a number of different countries are under attack here, even in Europe. Look at the current regime under Prime Minister Orban in Hungary. Look at the policy there vis-a-vis the Romani people in particular. Look at the clear rise in the last years, particularly since the current depression began in 2008, of anti-Semitism throughout Europe. All of these need to be countered. They need to be countered in the European Parliament. They need to be countered in our own engagements with what are, for the most part, right-wing and in some cases extreme right-wing members of both the European Parliament and national parliaments. Sadly, many of them in Eastern Europe, but any number also in Western Europe, and some of them domestically being bred as well. We need also to promote the absolute refusal to contemplate the most barbaric laws against apostasy and blasphemy. As you're well aware, apostasy, the change from one religion to another, blasphemy, holding in contempt someone's religious beliefs. We have ceased taking these things very seriously, by and large about a century ago. But there are countries where both are subject to execution. And this is, I think, in the 21st century, absolutely and completely heinous and unacceptable. And we need to promote briefly through, just in a couple of minutes, a few other points which I think we would want to think about. Question of humanism and the right to life, the abortion issue, is not so much in Britain, unless you live in Northern Ireland, a question that is immediately before us at the moment. I hope it won't become such. But of course, in many countries, no one would ever say that abortion is a good thing or something that anyone would ever engage in lightly, but we all know that unwanted pregnancies occur, and in many countries women do not have the right to terminate those pregnancies. Sometimes even in the case of rape or incest, and the closest one to us, of course, the Republic of Ireland, has passed some extraordinarily reprehensible legislation in this regard. Here, I think, again, as a part of perhaps our foreign policy, we would want to consider this as something we would want to promote. The right to die, euthanasia, is another issue that humanists have been long divided over. Many of us are not so young anymore, and with the onset of frailty, the possibility exists, as you all know, with a severe terminal illness, that you might well want to make the choice to make a nicer exit rather than a much more painful one. Again, like abortion, this is not something anyone would ever contemplate lightly. But at the same time, we recognize that there are certain circumstances in which it is quite justifiable to make such a claim. We would want to treat it with great tenderness and examine very carefully how we put forward and defended such a claim, but nonetheless, it's a justifiable claim, I think. Finally then, because I hope that there will be some questions about a range of these issues, two points. The first is the decline in the benefits system and in our health provision. We're all well aware, and I have vowed not to be party political in this regard, and in some respects, respecting the NHS and the privatization of the NHS has started out under Labour after all, but it is very clearly, I think, a part of the Tory party agenda to end the system which was founded in 1948 and to replace it with system private providers. I don't think that's a secret or an expression even of opinion any longer, although occasionally Tories do deny that that's what they're aiming at. Seems to me patently clear. I don't think, given the history of long service of the NHS, to the poor in particular, the well-to-do will always take care of themselves. We don't really have to worry about that. But remember back what it was like to be poor before 1948, when a visit to the doctor might cost you a fiver perhaps, but that was a lot of money when people were making £7, £8 a week on average. And you didn't go unless it was really a serious issue, and you didn't have operations if you couldn't afford them, and a pretty substantial part of the population, well over half, found themselves without adequate health care, as in the United States, at least prior to President Obama's health care reform. About 40% of the population were either not insured at all or woefully underinsured. We would, I think, want to be, as humanists, extremely wary about pushing down the poor sections of our society back into what is essentially, because the parallels in so many other instances are pretty obvious, a Victorian condition. Because that is where we're going, isn't it? The division between the rich and the poor since 2008 has deepened enormously, to the degree to which, looking forward 20 or 30 years, we can very easily see maintaining the course we're on at the moment, ending up with a society in which a very few extremely wealthy people live extraordinarily well, way beyond any needs they may have, and the vast majority are sunk into a pretty desperate condition. And that's exactly what late Victorian Britain looked like. Happens to be my period, and it was not a pretty sight. You all know your Dickens and Hugo and so on. Is this what we want to contemplate our future being? This is, maybe for some of us, not our future, but it's our children's future. And it's their children's future. Do we really want to push them back down into greater poverty, into the inability to see a doctor again? I don't think so. So I think that's a part of our agenda as well. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. Now, the rule of engagement is that you can't speak unless you have a microphone, and Simon is going around with the microphone now. So is there anyone sort of near Simon at the moment at the back there who's got a question for Greg? And just speak clearly into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to go back to the idea of harm, because to me that's a huge, big issue, and to try and define it, and to try and get people to accept what is defined, I think is going to be a huge problem. And we talk about, you spoke about how a person perceives harm themselves, and harm as it is, John Stuart Mill, and trying to persuade people. And I think trying to persuade people is very hard. And I wonder that maybe if you want to keep the pot not boiling over, it might be a thought to question them. In other words, the terrorist said, God is great. And the question might be, he's so great, does he need humans to defend him? Or can he punish on his own? And, you know, let them think about that instead of trying to persuade them that they're wrong. In other words, their thought must come through their own thinking.
The harm question is really very difficult. I mean, we've all recognized what immediate physical harm is. You get into a fight down at the pub and somebody punches you in the nose. It's clearly harming you. If I say, well, you know, I don't like the way you're dressing today, or I don't like what you just said about the political football team, or my religious beliefs, or something else, where am I harming you? It does depend to some degree on how I say it, doesn't it? And it does depend on how each party views the right that each has to to say and also to turn away. If you don't like what I'm saying, you can just walk away. There is a very large literature on this. It's an academic literature, but from a practical point of view, the whole point that Mill is trying to make is that if the harm is not immediate and clear, by and large we give the benefit of the doubt where freedom of speech is concerned. Most of the discussion of the harm principle is, of course, about freedom of action, not about freedom of speech. So the line drawn between standing in front of the mosque and shouting something obscene about the Prophet and having a discussion here as to whether the counter and contrary claims of different religions make sense when we weigh them comparatively against one another. These are two completely different kinds of speech act, so to speak. The context in which the speech act occurs is extremely important in this regard. But the point about introducing Mill here is that as far as speech is concerned, Mill is much more liberal than we are. And I think we have to give him his due in this regard. Now, the point about how you persuade people is sort of related to this, isn't it? People do have to achieve their own sense through their own reasoning about what it is justifiable to believe and to defend and what not. This is why, of course, the attack from even before the Enlightenment, but certainly from the Enlightenment period onwards, was on the authority of the priesthood as the teachers of morality. And we have seen, in fact, that it is a number of so-called radical imams who have been doing a great deal of damage in this regard. In particular, in enjoining younger people who are often, in these cases that we know of, unemployed, from deprived backgrounds, with a very lost and alienated sense of where they are in the society in which they live, and persuading them that engaging in jihad is the single answer out of all their problems, because they can jump over every earthly issue that they face and that irritates them and go straight to paradise by one great act in defense of the Prophet. We need to deal with how such individuals see the intermediary of the priest. The only way I think we could do this, to go back to the question of education, is through ensuring in school that there is a comparative religious perspective taught, and that we show that, in fact, the particular virtue in Protestantism in this regard, it is that you come to an appreciation of what the truth is of religion, not as a result of the intermediary of the priest, but as a result of your own rational process of thinking it through. But this is not going to occur, of course, unless people engage in debate with one another. The more communities exit from the system, the more people are educated only according to the beliefs of their own particular so-called faith, the less they will engage with others who adhere to different and contrary and diametrically opposed sets of beliefs. The less dialogue we have. Everything that is potentially good about this can only come out of dialogue. It can't come out of anger, it can't come out of withdrawal.
I think it was Mill that said, your freedom stops before your fist touches my nose. And I think that's generally the idea.
It's a good starting point. Thank you.
Roger, did you have a question?
Yes.
Then we'll come to you, John. Okay.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. These are my personal views, not those of the party I represent. How sustainable is the concept of a house of lords, which I dislike intensely? And unfortunately, what would be the impact of that on how a country relies on a monarchy as good a job as the Queen has done? And this then goes further to how can we have a head of state who is also the head of a particular church.
Okay, see, we're not going to deal with the unimportant and minor issues today. There aren't any here, sadly. What do we do with the lords? What do we do with the, if I could boil this down, what do we do with the monarch who's also the head of state? Well, I think it is desirable to have two legislative houses. Unicameral assemblies have a tendency to be precipitous, hasty, to get off the mark too quickly. A second house has the ability to stabilize, to retard, to delay slightly the process of legislation, particularly when a country is in difficulties. This is a very useful, it can be a hindrance, but it's a very useful mechanism to have in place. So I'm in favor of having two houses. Question is of course, we all regard the historical composition of the upper house as subject to a great many challenges, although by and large the lords who sit in the lords are of course not great landed magnates anymore. They are appointed by the various prime ministers who've come into office, and they are by and large party political appointees. Many of them are experts in their field. Many of them do very interesting and very good work. There are some layabouts and charlatans amongst them as well, so it would be in any group of that size. What principle should we use to replace that house? I think a mixture of, as I sort of tentatively suggested at the outset, a mixture of principles would meet most of the major proposals that have been put forward. I don't think they should all be appointed as they are at the moment now, particularly where one party in power is in power for a lengthy period of time, because that then makes the upper house effectively a mirror of whatever the governing party has been. Nor do I think they should all be elected, because you will end up by and large, although, of course, if we had proportional representation, you would have a very different composition in the upper house. But you would still essentially have a basic reflection of whatever the suffrage of the majority expressed at any one particular point in time. So I think there is potentially a mixture of principles, also expertise drawn from other sources. We could go on at length about this. The question of the monarch is an interesting thing in the country. As a Republican, I think the monarchy has seen its time in office. But Elizabeth II is immensely popular, of course, in this country. And so we have two conflicting principles here. One is that probably it makes more sense to have a head of state who is democratically elected because we're a democracy. The other is that, well, actually, we're generally tend very much to admire what one person, not necessarily any of her successors, what one person has done in that office. Having said that, of course, Elizabeth II also does not have the historic power that has been enjoyed. It is a symbolic role. It's a very powerful and interesting one. The separation between being the head of church and the monarch is a different issue entirely, however. There, I would say we would want to press for a removal of that office.
Roger, we need to let other people have a turn. So, sorry, Roger. John first, yeah, and then Susan.
What do you think a humanist perspective will bring to debate about membership of the EU and immigration into this country?
Well, that of course is one of the big issues before us. I said at the outset there was no humanist answer to this. And I don't think there is. There are many things that one could say. And these are two entirely separable issues, of course, as I'm sure you recognize. It would be possible to have very different views on one. And although most people tend to think that those who want to dramatically decrease immigration or suppress immigration to this country are also anti-EU, it's quite plausible to be a strong supporter of Europe and also to say, well, this is a reasonably small island. Let's look very carefully at our immigration policy, bearing in mind that we don't want our system to break down. And the system is at the creaking point, of course, particularly the health system this winter, as things now stand. You're probably aware that on balance, all the recent polls have shown this. Britain gains enormously from both its membership of the European Union and from immigration. First of all, we tend to forget that millions of Brits leave the country. 2 million live in Spain, I think, alone. We tend to forget that the vast majority of those who come to Britain from other countries have skills which are well above the average of skills possessed by our own native-born population. And this has been proven so often that, quite honestly, I can't see how UKIP is getting quite the mileage that it is getting at the moment, except that everybody thinks Farage is a good guy. Nice bloke to meet down at the house. But let's look a little bit more carefully at who he actually is. I think that as far as Britain's long-term economic interests are concerned, membership in the European Union, here's where one can make a humanist pitch, is dependent not merely upon the narrow, even medium and short-term economic gains, because we know that those are present. We know that the basic choice is that if we don't remain in Europe, we will join the United States. Now, is that what we want to do? I don't think so. I mean, I didn't, and I'm number two, I didn't emigrate to see that outcome. I think at the same time that it is reasonable to propose that within, this is what Angela Merkel has just recently suggested, that within the confines of domestic legislation, we do make it harder for immigrants to come to claim benefits on a very early basis. There's nothing wrong with that. Other countries have done it as well. But this is not the central issue at all. The central issue is the transferability of skills within the European Union. The other point I wanted to make about the politics that belong to the EU is many of you are old enough to remember this and to take the lesson to heart. We have to remember that the EU is a political union as well. Europe fought two enormously destructive wars in the 20th century and much of the rest of the time in the 3 or 4 centuries and beyond that beforehand. European countries were at each other's throats. We've had 70 years of peace. The European Union is one of the reasons why that peace is there, and that political price is enormously important. We have to be able to pay that, I think, and we tend to forget it. I haven't seen it mentioned at all in the last 6 months, that the peace we enjoy in Europe is, in part at least, a result of that political union. Do we really want to throw that away and go back to some other system of great power alliances similar to that we had beforehand? I don't think so. I think this is too valuable, and I think it's worth paying the price to keep Greece, because down the road Spain and Italy are going to be risky, Portugal to a degree as well. To keep Europe together, it is worth paying a price, because the price of war, and it is not impossible that one can envision war again in Europe. I don't think not in my lifetime, but in the lifetimes of my children, not impossible at all, particularly if the European Union breaks up. So I emphasize the political side, not the economic side.
Susan, was next, I think. Susan?
Yeah. What I wanted to ask, really, or make a comment about, is my daughter works in a very big school in Streatham, and if any of the secondary school, if any of the children make a homophobic or a racist remark, they are not just reprimanded, they have to do detention, they have to stay in. There's a very, very strict rules about it, which I think is right, of course, but there is a sort of conflict about freedom of expression as well, and I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, there's potentially a very complicated debate here, of course. What's the difference in making derogatory remarks about people's beliefs and derogatory remarks about particular practices, which in this case I think we have to say are ingrained or inscribed or unavoidable. I mean, most people don't believe that gay people are gay because they just decide, they wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to be gay from now on. They're biologically evolved in such a way that they express a sexual preference of a particular kind in a particular way, and there's really not a lot to be done about it. Historically, we have repressed them, and we've thankfully grown into sufficiently mature society that we now believe that if people want to act that way, they should be allowed to. And if they want to get married and so on, they should be allowed to. Is there a difference then between saying, well, you're a Catholic, and I really think the idea that the Pope is infallible is just ridiculous, and saying, oh, look, you have dark skin, and I really don't like that. I think there is a difference. I think genuinely there are areas where we should consider that freedom of debate, where we know historically that opinion can be pushed forward by that debate, should not only be tolerated but also positively encouraged. Is what I wish happened a lot more in schools. But I think it's a sign of maturity that we do not tolerate that type of intolerance in children any longer. Because we want them, of course, as you agree, to grow up to be adults who tolerate others who are different from them. Because they, in turn, will be different from other people who they would want to be tolerated by. It's supposed to be the Christian golden rule. Do unto others. So I think one has to draw a line here between certain types of belief which are susceptible to rational debate, particularly those where there is some presumption that there's no empirical proof as to what the belief is, and practices or ways of life which are effectively inscribed in the person's personality.
Jack, you were next. We just to let you know, we are running out short of time, so we're not going to get everyone's question in, I'm afraid. We'll start about half past, but Jack and then Paul will probably be all we have time for. Jack.
Right at the beginning of the talk, you were defining humanism. one of your definitions was the maximum happiness of the maximum number of people. Right at the end, it was only right at the end that you talked about the increasing inequality in our society and the attacks on the benefit systems and the working conditions and so on of our poorest, the working poor in our society. Surely, as a humanist, the two things are very clearly the opposites, and therefore all humanists should vote in May for a party or parties who are going to pay real attention to inequalities in our society.
Absolutely. If I had more time, I would have talked about the movement towards plutocracy, towards the rule by the rich, towards tax evasion, and to the extent that people scrounge on benefits, it's the big corporations who are costing us many, many, many times more than the very few people who are using the benefit system just for their own ends. And this is one of the most important problems, not only, of course, on a domestic scale, because the evasion of taxation, especially by the larger corporations, is an international issue. And without international policies, corporations just set up shop somewhere else with a lower corporation tax. So it is one of the single most important issues we have to think through. But yes, I mean, in general, if we had another hour, I would have said why a more egalitarian society is a more humane society.
Thank you very much. First, a couple of points. Firstly, I get disappointed in the fact that the word tolerance is not pushed enough in education. We don't encourage tolerance. We don't teach tolerance. Tolerance is the answer, surely. I mean, I firmly believe to be offended, you've got to want to be offended. If someone a fellow across the road points at me and shouts, "Hi, honky," I say, "Hi," and I take no notice, because it's irrelevant. If he turned around and said, "Your mother is a whore," I say, "Oh, fine if you think so." Tolerance. But we haven't got tolerance. We try to cherish it in the humanist society, but most people haven't. They walk down the street, they see a coloured fellow, they mumble some remark, because they can't say it out loud. If he said it out loud and the coloured guy just ignored it, he was tolerant, we wouldn't have this situation. And to your second point about how glowing the common market has given us, if we listed as a common market, I can't see that we would suddenly become aggressive and want to go to war with them, and I can't see the mass of Europe joining together and want to go to war with us. We're a small island. We might be big-headed and think we're wonderful, but we're very small. But the point is, as an ex-company director, the poor working class man nowadays is much worse off than he was 30 years ago when I was in business. When then would I would have even anticipated employing someone on a 0-hour contract or paying him the minimum wage. Every company that I've owned, we chopped the profit in half and shared it amongst the staff every year. And the companies that I've now sold are still running with members who have been there 28 and 30 years. But the average span of a life job nowadays is 3 years, they tell them. Why? Tolerance. And that's what we're lacking, and we're not teaching it to the young children.
We didn't say much that I disagree with, except that I do think there is a risk of greater conflict if the EU falls apart. I did want to just throw in one plea for cooperation there as a form of economic organization. You're exactly right that we are much worse off now than we were 30 years ago. And in fact, the phenomena that you described are now being suffered by millions and millions of laborers. If we had prevented these neoliberal economic principles from being widely diffused and popularized in the way that they have, we could have prevented this decline into much greater inequality. A humanist viewpoint on this is, of course, to try to reverse it all, to persuade people that there is another purpose for a company to be organized than merely to extract the maximum profit for the shareholders or the maximum salary for the owner, managing directors, and so on. That all laborers deserve a decent wage, that wage is not the minimum wage, but something substantial, that they have a right to long-term employment if they want it, that they have a right to contracts which enable them to have a certain flexibility with their working life, and so on. I agree entirely with you. But we have to act in this regard. Things are getting worse, and they will continue to get worse before they get better.
But Europe has encouraged that.
Paul, I'm sorry, we need to finish now. Okay. It's been wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for coming along this afternoon. Will you please put your hands together and give them a big round?
Thanks very much.
I think Paul will, Greg will get you back to talk about plutocracy next, or something along those lines. Okay, no need to rush away. Do stay, have a cup of tea, do stay to chat, look at our library, look at our leaflets. Make sure you get a programme, and see you again soon. Thank you very much. All right.